When you've sat in this chair as long as I have, you start to realize that nobody actually wakes up one morning and decides they want to ruin their life. People don't set out to become the villain in their family story. They don't plan to spend their 24th year of life screaming at the people who gave them birth or punching holes in the drywall of a bedroom they haven't paid a dime for in half a decade. But the truth of the matter is, we live in a world where results matter more than intentions. And when I looked at the file for a young man named Marcus, the results were devastating. I was sitting in my dressing room, the low hum of the studio lights beginning to vibrate through the floorboards, looking at a stack of police reports, therapist notes, and frantic emails from a mother who sounded like she was drowning in her own home. The title of the episode on the monitor read, "My Family Thinks I'm Out of Control." It's a common refrain, a defensive posture that immediately tells me the person behind the headline is living in a state of total denial. They see themselves as the victim of a conspiracy of judgment rather than the architect of their own chaos. I took a long breath and adjusted my tie in the mirror. I've seen thousands of these cases, but this one felt different. There was a specific kind of volatility here that usually points to a deeper, more fractured foundation. Marcus wasn't just a rebellious kid. He was a grown man who had weaponized his family's love against them. His mother, Diane, was a woman who had spent 20 years trying to protect her son from the world, only to realize she had inadvertently created a monster that she now had to live with. When I first saw the footage of Marcus in the pre-interview, my internal radar went off immediately. He had that particular brand of arrogant deflection, the folded arms, the rolling eyes, the smirk that says, "I'm the smartest person in the room, and you're all just out to get me." It's a mask, of course. It's a very thin, very brittle mask that covers a well of deep-seated inadequacy. But when that mask is paired with a hair-trigger temper and a total lack of accountability, it becomes a dangerous weapon. The central problem wasn't just Marcus's behavior. It was the ecosystem that allowed it to flourish. You don't get this out of control in a vacuum. You get there because people around you are afraid to set boundaries, or they've been beaten down so many times that they've traded their self-respect for a few hours of uneasy peace. Diane had reached her breaking point, but she was still carrying the heavy burden of mom guilt. She felt that if she truly held him accountable, she was failing as a parent. I knew that before I could even get to Marcus, I had to deconstruct the machinery of the family that was fueling his fire. He was the fire, but they were the oxygen. And if I didn't cut off that oxygen, the fire would just keep burning until there was nothing left but ash. I walked out of my dressing room and headed toward the stage, passing the green rooms where the tension was so thick you could practically feel it against your skin. I could hear Marcus in green room 4. He wasn't yelling, but his voice had that sharp, biting edge, the kind of tone that's designed to make everyone else feel small so he can feel big. He was arguing with a producer about the water brand they'd provided. It's always the little things with guys like Marcus. They fight over the brand of water because they can't face the reality of their broken bank accounts or their empty resumes. It's a displacement of power. If he can control the producer, he doesn't have to face the fact that he can't control his own impulses. When I stepped onto the stage and the audience settled, I looked at Diane sitting there. She looked 10 years older than her actual age. Her shoulders were hunched, her eyes were darting toward the wings where Marcus would soon emerge, and she was clutching her purse like it was a life raft. She was the picture of a woman who had been living in a war zone for far too long. Beside her was Marcus's younger sister, Chloe, who had a look of cold, hardened resentment. This is what people don't realize. When one person in a family is out of control, everyone else has to shrink to make room for them. Chloe had spent her entire adolescence shrinking, staying out of the way, and overachieving just to try and balance out the darkness Marcus brought into the house. I sat down, looked Diane in the eye, and didn't start with the anger. I started with the pain. I asked her when she last felt safe in her own home. The way her lip trembled before she could even get a word out told me everything I needed to know. She hadn't felt safe in years. She lived in a constant state of hypervigilance, listening for the sound of Marcus's footsteps, gauging the mood of his first words in the morning, wondering if today would be the day he finally crossed a line he couldn't come back from. Marcus, meanwhile, was waiting in the wings, likely convinced he was going to come out here and set the record straight. He thought he was the protagonist of a movie about an unfairly persecuted genius. My job was to show him he was actually the lead in a tragedy of his own making. What struck me most in those initial moments of analysis was the payoff. In psychology, we talk about the secondary gain. What does Marcus get out of being out of control? Most people would look at his life, no job, no friends, a trail of broken relationships, and see failure. But Marcus saw a different result. By being unpredictable and dangerous, he ensured that no one ever made demands of him. If Diane asked him to look for a job, he blew up. So she stopped asking. The payoff for his rage was total freedom from responsibility. It was a parasitic relationship masquerading as a family dynamic. He was feeding off their fear to sustain his indolence. And Diane, bless her heart, was serving him the meal on a silver platter because she was terrified of what would happen if he went hungry. As the stage manager signaled for Marcus to enter, I watched the monitor. He adjusted his jacket, put on that smug expression, and walked out with a stride that was meant to project confidence but screamed insecurity to anyone with eyes to see. He sat down, not next to his mother, but slightly apart, carving out his own island of defiance. He didn't look at me, he looked at the audience, looking for an opening, looking for a way to charm or intimidate. I let the silence hang for a moment. Silence is a powerful tool. It forces people to sit with themselves. Marcus couldn't handle it for more than 3 seconds. He started to speak, his voice smooth and rehearsed, beginning the narrative he told himself 1,000 times that he was just misunderstood, that his family was dramatic, and that the outbursts they filmed were taken out of context. I listened. I didn't interrupt. I let him spin his web of excuses because I wanted him to get comfortable in it. I wanted him to lay out every lie, every deflection, and every blame shift so that when I finally started pulling the threads, the whole thing would unravel in front of everyone. He talked about how he had big plans that his mother didn't understand. He talked about how Chloe was the favorite and how he was always the scapegoat. It was a masterclass in victimhood. But as he spoke, I was looking at the backstory, the years of missed opportunities, and the patterns of behavior that started long before the current crisis. To understand where Marcus was today, we had to go back to where the rot first started, to the moments where a no should have been a no, but instead became a maybe, and eventually a whatever you want. To understand why Marcus was sitting in that chair, radiating a mix of unearned confidence and simmering resentment, you have to look at the history. You have to look at the years of one more chance that Diane had handed out like candy. As Marcus continued to drone on about his misunderstood genius, I was mentally flipping through the timeline of his life. It wasn't a story of a kid who had been abused or neglected in the traditional sense. It was a story of a kid who had been loved into a state of total dysfunction. Diane had gone through a particularly nasty divorce when Marcus was 10. Her ex-husband was a man who led with his ego and followed with his temper. And when he walked out, he didn't just leave a hole in the family, he left a massive amount of collateral damage in the form of Diane's guilt. She was so determined that Marcus wouldn't feel the sting of his father's absence that she swung the pendulum all the way to the other side. She became a yes machine. If Marcus didn't want to do his homework, She did it for him so he wouldn't fail. If he got into a scuffle at school, she was in the principal's office the next morning blaming the other kids or the teachers for picking on her boy. She thought she was being a protective mother. In reality, she was stripping him of the very tools he needed to survive in the real world. She was teaching him that rules were for other people and that if he made enough noise, the world would eventually bend to his will. By the time he hit high school, that pattern was baked into his DNA. He wasn't just a spoiled kid anymore. He was a young man who had no internal compass because he'd never been allowed to get lost and find his own way back. He had never felt the sting of a natural consequence, and that's a dangerous way to grow up. I watched Marcus's face as I began to probe into these early years. He didn't like it. He wanted to talk about the present, about how mean his sister was or how his mom was constantly nagging him about a job. He didn't want to look at the architecture of his own personality. Marcus, I said, leaning in, you tell me you're a man of great potential. You tell me you have these business ideas that are going to change the world, but I'm looking at your track record and I don't see a single thing you've started and finished in 5 years. Not one. So, are you a victim of circumstance or are you just a professional at making excuses? He scoffed, looking at the ceiling. You don't get it, Dr. Phil. The system is rigged. I try to get a job, but they want people who are drones. I'm an innovator. It was a classic failure to launch narrative, but with a violent twist. As we moved into the escalation phase of their family life, the stories became more chilling. Diane started talking about how the requests for money turned into demands. The demands turned into threats. She described a night 6 months ago when she'd refused to give him her credit card so he could go out with friends. Marcus hadn't just yelled, he'd systematically destroyed the kitchen. He'd smashed the plates, kicked a hole in the refrigerator door, and stood over her, screaming until his face was purple, daring her to call the police. And did she? No. She cleaned up the glass, went into her room, and cried herself to sleep while he went out anyway, having taken the card from her purse while she was in the bathroom. This is the point where a lot of people watching at home get frustrated. They ask, why doesn't she just kick him out? But it's never that simple when it's your own flesh and blood. Diane was trapped in what I call the parental trap. She was terrified that if she put him on the street, he'd end up in jail or worse, dead. She felt responsible for his failure, so she kept trying to fix it by providing him a soft place to land. But what she didn't realize and what I had to make her see was that the soft place she was providing was actually a grave. She was burying him in comfort, and as long as he had a roof over his head and food in his stomach, he had zero incentive to change. He was a shark that had found a steady food source, and he wasn't going to swim away as long as the feeding continued. Chloe, the sister, finally spoke up, and her voice was like ice. She talked about the black cloud that entered the house every time Marcus walked through the door. She talked about the birthday parties he'd ruined, the holidays spent in silence because everyone was afraid of setting him off. She looked at her brother not with love, but with a profound, weary disgust. He's a bully, she said simply. He's a bully who uses mom's heart as a punching bag. Marcus didn't even flinch. He just rolled his eyes and muttered something about her being dramatic. That's the hallmark of this kind of narcissism, a total lack of empathy for the people who are suffering the most because of your actions. To Marcus, Chloe's pain was just an inconvenience, an obstacle to him getting what he wanted. The escalation hadn't stopped at property damage. Diane revealed through tears that Marcus had recently started posturing, getting in her physical space, using his size to intimidate her. He hadn't hit her, but he'd made sure she knew he could. That's a form of domestic terrorism. When you're afraid to speak in your own home because you're worried about a physical confrontation with your son, The relationship isn't just strained, it's toxic and dangerous. I looked at Marcus and asked him if he was proud of making his mother tremble. He gave me a look of pure, unadulterated defiance. I don't make her tremble, he said. She does that to herself. She's weak. She's always been weak. That was the moment the temperature in the room changed. It was a cold, calculated dismissal of the woman who had sacrificed everything for him. It wasn't just a lack of control, it was a lack of basic human decency. I knew then that we weren't just dealing with a troubled young man. We were dealing with someone who had weaponized his own dysfunction to create a kingdom where he was the only citizen who mattered. The escalation had reached its peak. They hadn't come to the show to find a way to live together. They had come because they were at the edge of a cliff, and Marcus was the one trying to push them over. I spent some time deconstructing his business plans. It turns out his innovation was a series of half-baked ideas for apps that he'd never written a single line of code for. He spent his days on the internet researching, which was really just code for playing video games and reading conspiracy theories that reinforced his belief that the world owed him a living. He had built an entire reality where he was a titan of industry and waiting, and his mother's refusal to fund his lifestyle was an act of betrayal. It's a delusional state, but it's a comfortable one. If you're a genius whom the world doesn't understand, then your failure isn't your fault, it's the world's fault. It's a very convenient way to live when you're 30 years old and still sleeping in the room you grew up in. The tension on that stage was a physical thing. Diane was looking at me, her eyes pleading for a way out. Chloe was looking at her brother with a look that said she'd already mourned his loss. And Marcus was looking at his watch. He thought this was just a hurdle he had to clear before he could go back to his life of leisure. He didn't realize that the clock had just run out on his games. I told him, Marcus, you've spent your whole life being the star of your own show, but today the audience is tired of the plot and the producers, your mother and sister, are about to cancel you. He didn't believe me. He still thought he could charm his way out or anger his way through. But I've seen this script before, and I knew exactly how the next act was going to go. We were moving toward the confrontation, and it wasn't going to be pretty, but it was going to be the first honest thing that had happened to this family in 20 years. I leaned forward, my elbows on my knees, and looked Marcus right in the eyes. This is the moment in every one of these cases where the air gets thin. I call it the collision with reality. Up until now, Marcus had been living in a world of his own making, a world where he was a misunderstood visionary and everyone else was just an obstacle or a resource to be exploited. He was comfortable in his delusions because they were shielded by his mother's fear and his own arrogance. But the studio lights have a way of stripping those shields away. I looked at the folder in my lap, which contained the digital footprint of his supposed business development. I'd had my team look into those apps he claimed to be building. What they found wasn't a history of coding or market research. It was 18 hours a day of high-stakes gaming and message board arguments. Marcus, I said, my voice dropping into that low, steady register I use when the games are over, you talk about being an innovator. You talk about these big plans that are just around the corner. But let's look at the truth. My team looked at your computer usage for the last month. You haven't written a single line of code. You haven't filed for a business license. You haven't even looked at a tutorial. What you've done is spend 300 hours playing a fantasy game where you're a king. And the reason you do that is because in that game, you're powerful. But when you turn that computer off, you're a 30-year-old man who can't even pay for his own cell phone. You aren't misunderstood, Marcus. You're terrified. You're terrified that if you actually try to do something real, you'll fail. And if you fail, you won't have the genius label to hide behind anymore. So you stay out of control because it's easier to be a rebel than it is to be a failure. The smirk flickered. For a split second, I saw the mask slip and I saw the raw, naked fear of a man who realized his bluff had been called. But then the defense mechanism kicked in. His face flushed red, and he lunged forward in his seat. You don't know me. You've got some team looking at my stuff. That's an invasion of privacy. My mom probably gave you the passwords. This is exactly what I'm talking about. Everyone is always ganging up on me. He was shouting now, his voice cracking, looking around at the audience as if he expected them to rise up in his defense, but they were silent. They saw what I saw. A man-child throwing a tantrum because he'd been caught in a lie. I didn't blink. I didn't pull back. Sit down, Marcus, I said, with a weight of authority that usually stops a person in their tracks. You're not going to shout me down. You can intimidate your mother with that noise, but it doesn't work on me. You're not a victim here. The person who's been invaded is your mother. She's had her peace of mind stolen, her home turned into a battlefield, and her bank account drained by a son who thinks he's too good to work a regular job. You want to talk about privacy? You're living in her house. You're eating her food. You're using her internet. You gave up your right to privacy when you became a dependent adult who refuses to contribute. I turned to Diane, who was shaking, her hands pressed against her mouth. Diane, look at him, I said. This isn't the little boy who needed you to protect him from the world. This is a man who is using your love as a weapon against you. You think you're being a good mother by giving him one more chance, one more month, one more $100, but you're not. You're an enabler. Every time you bail him out, you're buying him another ticket on a train that's headed for a brick wall. You're not helping him live, you're helping him stay dead to the world. You're loving him to death, Diane. If you don't stop, if you don't set a boundary that you're willing to defend with your life, he's never going to change. Because why should he? He's got it made. He's got a chef, a maid, and a bank, and all he has to do is scream every once in a while to keep the service coming. The audience was dead quiet. This is the breakthrough moment, but it's not always a happy one. Sometimes the breakthrough is just the first time everyone stops lying. Chloe, the sister, was nodding, tears streaming down her face. She'd been waiting for someone to say this for a decade. She'd been the one watching her mother crumble, the one who'd had to pick up the pieces while Marcus played king in his room. Marcus was vibrating with rage, but he didn't leave. They rarely do. They stay because deep down, they're desperate for someone to stop them. They're desperate for someone to say, the game is over. Marcus, I continued, you have a choice today. You can keep this act up. You can walk off this stage, go back to that house, and keep being the bully. But here's what's going to happen. Your mother is going to eventually run out of money, or she's going to have a heart attack from the stress, and then you'll be on the street anyway, but you'll be there with no one who loves you. Or you can admit right now that you're scared. You can admit that you've lost your way and that you don't know how to be a man. There is no shame in being lost, Marcus. There is only shame in refusing to look at the map. He sat there, his chest heaving, looking like he wanted to punch me and cry at the same time. This is the moment where I look for the inflection point. It's that tiny window where a person's pride is finally outweighed by their pain. For Marcus, it was a long time coming. He looked at Diane, and for the first time in the entire hour, he didn't look at her with contempt. He looked at her and saw how tired she was. He saw the gray in her hair that hadn't been there a few years ago. He saw the way she was flinching, even though he wasn't even moving toward her. I'm not a bad guy, he whispered, his voice finally losing its edge. It was the first honest thing he'd said. It wasn't an excuse, it was a plea. I didn't say you were a bad guy, Marcus, I replied, softening my tone just enough to let him in. I said you were doing bad things. I said you were making choices that are destroying the people you claim to love. You got a lot of bad guy behavior to account for, but that doesn't mean it's who you are. But if you want to be someone else, you have to start by being honest about who you've been. You've been a bully. You've been a parasite. You've been a coward. Are you ready to stop being those things? The silence stretched out. I could feel the producers in the back holding their breath. This is the part of the show where we find out if we're going to have a transformation or just a temporary pause in the chaos. Marcus looked down at his hands. He looked at Chloe, who was still looking at him with that mixture of hope and hurt. He looked back at me. I don't know how, he said. I don't know how to do anything else. That's the most terrifying admission a 30-year-old man can make. It's the admission of total incompetence. But it's also the only foundation we can build on. As long as he was pretending to be a genius, I couldn't help him. Now that he was admitting he was a novice at life, we had a starting point. I looked at Diane. He just told you the truth, Diane. He's been acting like a monster because he doesn't know how to be a man. And you've been helping him stay a boy. So here's the deal. We're going to give him the tools. We're going to get him into a program where he can learn what it means to be responsible, to work, to have a schedule, and to deal with his anger. But there's a condition. He doesn't go back to your house. Not tonight, not next week. Not until he's proven through months of hard work that he's earned the right to be a guest in your home. Diane gasped. The parental trap was snapping shut, and she was terrified. But where will he go, she asked, her voice small. He'll go where he needs to go to save his life, I told her. And if you say no, Diane, then you're the one who's signing his death warrant. You have to be strong enough to let him be uncomfortable. Can you do that? Can you love him enough to let him fail on his own so he can finally learn how to succeed? This was the ultimate confrontation. It wasn't just with Marcus, it was with the entire family system. We had to break the cycle of enabling and entitlement right there under the lights in front of the world. Marcus looked at his mother, and Diane looked at Marcus. For the first time in 20 years, the yes didn't come automatically. She looked at me, took a deep, shuddering breath, and said, yes, I can do that. The silence that followed Diane's yes was the loudest thing in the room. It was the sound of a 20-year-old structural support beam finally snapping under the weight of a house that had been built on sand. I looked at Marcus. He was frozen. He had spent his entire life knowing that no matter how high he cranked the volume, no matter how much glass he broke, or how many insults he hurled, that yes would always be there. It was his safety net, his fuel, and his excuse. To hear it turn into a no in front of a national audience was a seismic shift for him. He didn't explode. He didn't scream. He just sat there looking smaller than I'd ever seen him as the reality of his situation began to sink in. He wasn't going home to his comfortable bed. He wasn't going back to his gaming console and his late-night snacks funded by a woman he'd spent years demeaning. He was going into the unknown, and for the first time, he didn't have a map or a driver. When the cameras finally cut and the lights dimmed, the real work began. People think the show is the end of the process, but in my world, the show is just the diagnostic phase. The treatment phase starts the moment we walk off that stage. I walked backstage and saw Marcus standing near the craft services table, looking lost. He wasn't the arrogant innovator anymore. He was a man who realized he didn't even have a toothbrush of his own. I pulled him aside, away from the producers and the bustle of the crew. I put a hand on his shoulder, not as a gesture of comfort, but as a grounding force. I told him, Marcus, the next 72 hours are going to be the hardest of your life. You're going to want to run. You're going to want to call your mother and tell her you've changed, that you've seen the light, just to get her to let you come back. But I've told her that if she picks up that phone, she's failing you. This is where you find out who you are when you have nothing left to hide behind. He looked at me, and I saw a flicker of that old defiance, but it was weak. What if I can't do it, Dr. Phil? What if I'm just broken? He asked. It was a moment of genuine vulnerability, the kind of breakthrough that usually takes months in traditional therapy. When you strip away the ego and the anger, what's left is often a very frightened child who never learned how to grow up. I told him, "You aren't broken, Marcus. You're just unformed. You're like a piece of clay that's never been put in the kiln. You've stayed soft because it was easy. Now, we're going to put some heat on you, and we're going to see what kind of shape you take, but you have to stay in the fire. If you jump out now, you'll stay soft for the rest of your life." We had a transport team ready to take him directly to a facility in the high desert, a place that specializes in what we call reparenting for adult men who have failed to launch. It's not a spa. It's not a place where you sit around and talk about your feelings all day. It's a place where you wake up at 5 a.m., you work the land, you learn a trade, and you sit in group therapy where other men who have been exactly where you are call you out on every single lie you try to tell. I watched him get into the SUV. He didn't look back at his mother. He just stared out the window, looking at the city lights of Los Angeles as they faded into the distance. It was the last time he'd see his old life for a very long time. Meanwhile, Diane and Chloe were in a different green room, and the atmosphere there was just as heavy. Diane was grieving. People don't understand that when you stop enabling someone, it feels like a death. She was mourning the relationship she thought she had, and she was mourning the child she'd been trying to save. I sat with them for a while, making sure they understood the extinction burst that was coming. In psychology, an extinction burst is what happens when you stop reinforcing a behavior. The person doesn't just stop the behavior, they ramp it up to an extreme level in a desperate attempt to get the reward back. I warned Diane that Marcus would try to manipulate her. He'd send letters, or if he got a phone call, he'd use every emotional trigger in his arsenal. He'd tell her he was being abused, that he was sick, that he was suicidal. He'd try to make her the villain so she'd go back to being the savior. "You have to be the wall, Diane," I told her. "Every time you bend, you're teaching him that his old tactics still work. You have to love him enough to be the person he hates for a while. If you can do that, you might get a son back. If you can't, you're going to lose him forever, one way or another." Chloe was the one who grabbed her mother's hand. She was going to be the enforcer. She was going to be the one to change the locks, to handle the mail, and to remind Diane why they were doing this when the house felt too quiet and the guilt started to creep in at 2 a.m. The first month was brutal. We stayed in touch with the facility, and the reports weren't good initially. Marcus was a nightmare. He tried to start fights with the staff. He refused to participate in the labor details, and he spent 3 days sitting in the middle of a field, refusing to move because he said it was below his dignity to pull weeds. He was waiting for the world to fold. He was waiting for his mother to show up in a car and rescue him, but she didn't come. For the first time in 30 years, the yes machine was broken. When he finally realized that no one was coming to save him from his own choices, something shifted. It wasn't a miracle, it was a surrender. He started to work, not because he wanted to, but because he was hungry and tired of being the only one sitting in the dirt while the other men were eating and sleeping in the barracks. I remember getting a call from the program director about 6 weeks in. He told me that Marcus had spent 4 hours in a vocational workshop learning how to weld. He wasn't great at it, and he'd burned his glove twice, but he hadn't thrown a tantrum. He hadn't blamed the welder or the instructor. He just wiped his brow and tried again. That might sound like a small thing to most people, but for Marcus, it was a revolution. It was the first time he'd accepted a struggle without turning it into a war. He was learning the dignity of honest effort. He was learning that failure isn't a catastrophe, it's just data. But the road to recovery isn't a straight line. About 3 months in, Diane had a moment of weakness. She had received a letter from Marcus, a long, rambling letter where he apologized for everything, but also mentioned how much his back ached and how he missed her cooking. It was a classic hook designed to pull on her heartstrings. She called me crying, saying she wanted to send him a care package with some of his favorite snacks. I had to be the one to tell her no. Diane, I said, if you send him that box, you're sending him a message that he's still your little boy. He doesn't need snacks. He needs to earn his own treats. He needs to feel the hunger for a better life more than he feels the hunger for a cookie. Don't rob him of his progress because you're uncomfortable with his discomfort. It was hard for her to hear, but she stayed strong. She didn't send the box, and Marcus, when he didn't get a response, didn't spiral. He just went back to work. By the 4th month, the reports from the high desert started to take on a different tone. The anger hadn't vanished. Anger like that doesn't just evaporate, but it had transformed. It had gone from a weapon he used to hurt others into a tool he used to push himself. The program director told me about a specific afternoon when Marcus had been tasked with repairing a heavy-duty fence in the middle of a windstorm. In the past, he would have spent 3 hours explaining why it was impossible, why the tools were faulty, or why it was someone else's fault the fence broke in the first place. Instead, Marcus had put on his goggles, hunkered down against the wind, and worked until his hands were raw and the job was done. When he finished, he didn't look for a round of applause. He just looked at the fence, nodded to himself, and went to get his dinner. That is what we call the internalization of reward. He was no longer performing for his mother's attention or my approval. He was working for his own self-respect. We brought the family back together for a follow-up session 6 months after that first day on stage. I wanted to see if the changes were skin deep or if they had reached the bone. When Marcus walked into the room, the first thing I noticed wasn't his clothes or his hair, it was his eyes. The smirk was gone. The look of a hunted animal, always scanning for a way to manipulate the situation, had been replaced by a quiet, steady gaze. He looked Diane in the eye, and for the first time in her life, she didn't flinch. She had spent those 6 months in her own kind of training, working with a therapist to rebuild the boundaries he'd spent a lifetime tearing down. She had learned that saying no was the highest form of love she could offer him. The conversation that afternoon wasn't filled with the dramatic fireworks of our first meeting. It was something much more powerful. It was honest. Marcus didn't talk about his innovations or his genius. He talked about his welding certification. He talked about the $300 he'd saved from his work-study program. And then he did something I wasn't sure he was capable of when we started this journey. He turned to Chloe. He didn't ask for her forgiveness. He knew he hadn't earned it yet, but he acknowledged the black cloud he'd brought into her life. He told her he was sorry for the years she had to spend shrinking so he could be big. Chloe didn't hug him. She didn't cry. She just listened. And for the first time, she didn't look at him with disgust. She looked at him with a cautious, guarded hope. And in a family like this, hope is a very big start. As I sat there watching them, I realized that the outcome wasn't a happily ever after where everything is forgotten. That's not how real life works. The outcome was that they were finally living in the same reality. Marcus was no longer a parasite, and Diane was no longer a host. They were two adults who were learning how to navigate a relationship based on mutual respect rather than fear and guilt. Marcus didn't move back home that day. He moved into a sober living facility near his new job at a local fabrication shop. He paid his own deposit with the money he'd earned. He bought his own groceries. He was finally starting his life at 30 years old, and while he was behind his peers in years, he was ahead of most people in his understanding of what it actually takes to be a man. The lesson in all of this, The thing I want people to take away when they look at a case like Marcus's is that you can't change what you don't acknowledge. Marcus had to acknowledge his own cowardice before he could find his courage. Diane had to acknowledge her own enabling before she could find her strength. It's a painful process. It's messy, it's loud, and it often feels like things are getting worse before they get better. But the truth is, the pain of changing is nothing compared to the pain of staying the same. Marcus could have spent another 30 years in that bedroom getting out of control until there was nothing left of him or his mother. Instead, he chose the hard road. And the hard road is the only one that actually leads somewhere worth going. I stood up, shook his hand, a firm, calloused hand this time, and told him to keep his head down and his eyes on the work. He didn't need my help anymore. He had finally decided to be the hero of his own story, not by being a genius, but by being a man of his word.